The title of my talk is Restoring Historical Photographs, Sir Everard in Thurn and the Royal Geographical Society, 1893. And today I really wanted to share with you some of the work that I've been doing for my PhD, as well as my future goals for the project. And as Maria mentioned, I'm working on connecting historical photographs from the RGS's archives with communities and Indigenous organisations in the Rupununi in Guyana. And this work is born out of community-led research on Indigenous heritage, as well as increasing calls within the museum sector to decolonise colonial collections. And I wanted to share a particular photograph with you today from the RGS's collections and introduce an approach for what I call restoring colonial photographs. So I'll start by sharing a bit about the historical context for the photograph that you see on the screen. And this image is captioned "True Carib with armlets, small necklace of bush hog's teeth," taken in 1890 by Sir Everard in Thurn in then British Guyana and held in the RGS's collections. Thurn was a curator at the British Guyana Museum at Georgetown from 1877 to 1882, and he later became a government agent from 1891 to 1899. He's possibly best known for leading the first successful ascent of Mount Roraima in 1884 on an expedition sponsored by the RGS, and this was popularised in Arthur Conan Doyle's 1912 novel, The Lost World. So if we could do the next slide. Thank you. So RGS accession records show that in 1893, Thurn donated 29 anthropological photographs, including the one on the previous slide, of Indigenous peoples of British Guyana, and I featured a few of these other kind of photographs on the screen. And in the archives, the people in these photos are unnamed, instead labelled only as Caribs, Arawaks, and Waru, which are basically terms that Thurn used to connote Indigenous types rather than unique individuals, or indeed sort of specific Indigenous names. Next slide. So in Hannah Turner's book, Cataloguing Culture, they referred to the power and structuring logic of colonial archives, noting that colonialism continues to act as an organising force within museum catalogues. And the caption given to the photograph on screen, True Carib, represents a category rather than a fully fledged person, I believe, shaped through archival documenting systems. Next slide. So as Michael Taussig argued in Shamanism, Colonialism and the Wild Man, which analyses cultures of terror in colonial Latin America, the language and imagery of colonial cultures can only be demythologized when we come to realize that objects, such as the photograph I'm speaking to you about today, are colonial fetishizations of history. For Taussig, the power of these objects lies in the language used to describe them. And he quoted Ludwig Wittgenstein, who noted that a whole mythology is deposited in our language. Taussig believed that language makes and fixes colonial mythologies, which inscribe in a Foucauldian manner what he dubbed as the mythology of the Indian onto bodies shaped by colonial fantasies. As such, he called for the demythologizing of history through re-evaluating colonial language. Reading Taussig's work and looking at these unnamed photographs, I began to wonder how and whether we can rupture the grip that colonialism continues to have on these archives and collections. Part of the answer, I believe, lies in naming individuals in these photographs. Next slide. So influential Brazilian educator Paulo Freire and founding father of participatory action research wrote in Pedagogy of the Oppressed about the importance of naming as it relates to power. And he noted that to exist humanly is to name the world, to change it, and that because dialogue is an encounter, it must not be a situation where some name on behalf of others. So for Freire, naming had the potential to humanize the world and dismantle oppressive colonial legacies only through participatory education. Next slide. So a broader movement to decolonize colonial archives growing throughout the 20th century and intensifying since the 90s has led to numerous institutions such as Oxford University's Pitt Rivers Museum to connect colonial collections with their source communities. And this work basically rests upon the assumption that colonial artifacts contain latent possibilities, or as anthropologist Paul Basu has dubbed them, affordances, that can activate lost histories, repair injustices, exchange knowledge, and enhance intercultural understanding. And in my research, I've adopted a similar approach. So before beginning field work, I'm currently trawling through archives to begin the humanizing work of naming individuals in these photograph collections. And in the case of this picture, I was able to discover the name of the person by looking through historical journals. And I wanted to share with you what I found today. So in 1892, Thurn presented a paper titled The Anthropological Uses of the Camera at the Royal Anthropological Institute in London, where he also showcased the photograph on screen. And he noted that his intent in taking these photographs served three main functions. Firstly, he expressed a desire for anthropological photography, not merely to capture images of what he called primitive bodies, but to regard these persons as living beings in the environments in which they lived. Secondly, he wanted to create a documentary record of what he called the primitive phases of life. And thirdly, he also wanted to catalogue objects of ethnological interest, which in this case were the armlets and the necklace that the person in this photograph is wearing. So next slide. So I really quickly want to read the passage that Thurn read during his lecture to describe this photograph to the audience at the RAI in 1892. And he said that one of the commonest articles from Guyana seen in museums is the necklace of peccary teeth, much affected by all the Carib tribes. But in now showing you one of the finest specimens of this ornament I have ever seen, it will probably gain very much in interest from the fact that I'm able at the same time to throw onto the screen a picture of the actual necklace on the Makushi named Lonk, from whose shoulders I acquired it. And it may, in passing, be of interest to add that these necklaces, in the manufacture of which only the tusk teeth of the peccary are used, so that, in proportion to its size, each represents a very large number of animals, are almost highly valued as heirlooms and as representing the accumulated prowess, not only of the wearer for the time being, but also of his ancestors, for this property is handed down in the male line of descent and is added to by each holder. So in this passage, Thurn actually both named the individual in the photograph, Lonk, as well as the indigenous group they belong to, which is the Makushi. So if we go to the next slide. So having learned from my archival work that the person pictured in the photograph was a Makushi named Lonk, the next step for me is to really begin connecting photographs with communities in Guyana. And on this point, for anthropologists Joshua Bell and Christopher Pinney, returning photographs to their source communities is a sensory practice, whereby people begin to weave new stories around them that connect the past and the present. And in my research, I've started thinking about how historical photographs are generative and whether Indigenous research methods such as storytelling can help rewrite or restory colonial photographs. And the point that I really want to make today is that it's only by undertaking quite extensive work in archives or connecting photographs with descendant communities that naming individuals becomes possible. And I side with Freya in believing that naming is a humanizing act and that language has some capacity to decenter colonial narratives that still govern collections' cataloguing systems. I also believe that these photographs have the potential to become embedded in new ontologies in Guyana and generate new knowledge of use to communities beyond their original colonial readings. And what I really hope this exercise has shown you is that colonial archives everywhere contained unnamed photographs of Indigenous peoples. Their names or complex identities might not always be so straightforwardly unearthed as Lonk's was, but I believe that archival digging and community engagement is a step in the right direction towards reworking their colonial mythologies.